The Honourable Martin Aldridge has a call.
Thanks, Madam President, and it's a pleasure to rise on behalf of the National Party and support the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Peter Collier, and it is a very timely motion that we consider this issue at this time, particularly as we only have just 2 sitting weeks remaining after this week before we go into the usual winter recess, Madam President. I want to start my contribution today on the first limb of this motion and add my remarks to those who have gone before me who have made some observations about the significant challenge that our state and other states and territories and indeed other countries have faced as arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. Often people have said that we live in extraordinary times, that we live in unprecedented times, and members who have spoken prior to me have laid out quite well the significant health and economic impacts of the pandemic. And I suspect that particularly the economic impact of the pandemic is likely to linger longer than the direct health impacts that our country has experienced and is continuing to experience, obviously at a much smaller scale than we once were. Members have already spoken about the impact on the state's finances, and I guess we all wait with some anticipation for the October 8 state budget to get some clarity around what the impact is both on revenue and expenditure on the state budget and the forward estimates, but also the significant impact on household finances. And I think probably the biggest impact, which is going to last longer than those 2 things, is confidence of Western Australians to invest, to spend money, those who are looking for work, those who have been impacted by the pandemic, most likely in economic terms more so than in health terms. I want to, at this point, Madam President, also congratulate the role that government has played across Australia at both state and territory level and indeed at the Australian government level. I think there's been extraordinary leadership shown, and I think in every jurisdiction significant bipartisanship shown, Madam President, with respect to supporting the governments which are in power to make decisions. I think criticisms have been measured, and certainly we've seen parliaments respond in extraordinary ways in dealing with the response to the pandemic to make sure that government is supported in doing so. Now, I admit in some regards that has meant that we haven't done our job as fully as perhaps we might ordinarily would do, but I think that's out of an understanding and an appreciation for these uncharted waters that Western Australia and indeed the rest of the world faces in these times. Now, those decisions, Madam President, in my mind at least, do come with some strings attached, and one of those strings is that I expect decisions to be made by governments that would be free of politics and based on sound advice to government. And this is certainly something, Madam President, that I want to turn my contribution now to the second limb of the motion, because it is something that I've had some difficulty with during the last few weeks and months in terms of developing a greater understanding from this state government in particular as to the basis for which it is making some of its decisions. And Madam President, you'd be aware of, I've made a member statement on a previous and recent occasion with respect to answers provided to this House by the Minister representing the Minister for Police. And I don't want to go to the specifics of my member statement at that time because they stand in the Hansard of this place. But it was quite an extraordinary circumstance where I was invited by the Minister's office to seek clarity during question time on behalf of my constituents as to how to interpret the directions of the State Emergency Coordinator, the directions which come with a penalty of imprisonment and $50,000 in infringement, and I got a non-answer from the Minister on more than one occasion. Now, it's interesting that in these times where we have extended probably an extraordinary level of bipartisanship to the way in which government is governing, that we would get such politically charged responses to what are legitimate and not politically charged questions that are asked in this place. And I want to turn, Madam President, to a question that I've asked in recent times of the Premier, and this was on the 19th of May 2020, so not even 1 month ago, Madam President. And on the 19th of May, I asked in question without notice 460 to the Leader of the House representing the Premier a 4-part question. And I asked this: I refer to the prohibition on regional travel directions established by the State Emergency Coordinator on 31 March 2020 and replaced on 17 May 2020. 1. Did the Premier, the State Emergency Coordinator or the State Disaster Council receive advice from the Chief Medical Officer of Western Australia, the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee or the Department of Health recommending the implementation of intrastate travel restrictions? 2, if yes, to one, on what date was advice received, and please table that advice. 3, did the advice received identify that on public health grounds travel should be restricted in the form and manner that was established by the State Emergency Coordinator? And 4, is the Premier aware that despite assurances by the Minister for Transport in answer to Legislative Council question without notice 334 asked by the Honourable Colin de Grasset MLC, travel by regular passenger transport to regions with restricted access is occurring without impediment by airlines or the West Australian Police Force? So that 4-part question, Madam President, was legitimate. It raised in the 4th part a legitimate concern that travel was occurring contrary to the regional travel restrictions that were instituted by the State Emergency Coordinator, whereas we had these regional checkpoints established, so bringing that to the government's attention. And the first 3 limbs were seeking information around the advice government was receiving in terms of informing these decisions. The Honourable Sue Ellery replied, I thank the Honourable Member for some notice of the question. 1 to 4, and as I've previously remarked, you know it's not going to end well when you get an answer that addresses all 4 parts of your question in one go. She said this: the Premier meets several times a week with the COVID-19 emergency team, which includes representatives from the Department of Health. All advice is considered when making decisions on travel restrictions. Well, a pretty cute answer, Madam President, and one that really didn't address any of the legitimate questions that I had raised, including the lack of attention that was being paid to our regional airports. So people were being able to travel unencumbered by air to regional locations, but yet if you travelled by road, you were likely to be intercepted by a roadside police checkpoint. So we got no answer to that question, Madam President, despite my best attempts on the 19th of May. Interestingly, the next day, the Honourable Robin Scott rose in question without notice 492 and asked a very simple question. I refer to the current intrastate border travel bans in place for WA. Will the Minister release the health advice that guided the Minister's decision to open up Perth to the southwest of the state, but not to the north or the east, and if not, why not? And the Honourable Alana Cloissy replied, I thank the Honourable Member for some notice of the question. I table the attached statement from the Chief Health Officer of Western Australia. Now, what the Parliamentary Secretary tabled was a media statement from the Chief Health Officer on the 20th of May 2020, the day after I asked my question on the 19th of May 2020, and that was the advice that guided the Minister's decision. So this all seems a little bit after the fact, Madam President. On the 21st of May, the day after the Honourable Robin Scott's question, I rose and asked question without notice 520 to the Minister, Parliamentary Secretary representing the Minister for Health. And I won't read out the entire question in the interest of time, Madam President, but the 3rd and 4th limb of the question said this: has the CMO or the Department of Health provided advice directly to the Premier, the State Disaster Council or the State Emergency Coordinator related to or recommending intrastate and or interstate travel restrictions? 4, on what date was the advice identified in 3 requested and or received, and can the Minister please table that advice? The Honourable Alana Clossy replied, 3 to 4, the advice provided to the State Disaster Council on 20 March 2020 is Cabinet in confidence. So, Madam President, I'm rather confused. I mean, I'm not sure that the State Disaster Council is a subcommittee of Cabinet, but perhaps it is, and perhaps the government will clarify that point for me. But nevertheless, I'm not quite sure how advice by the Chief Health Officer of Western Australia would reveal the deliberations of Cabinet and therefore be Cabinet in confidence in any event. But it's interesting, the remark of the Honourable Alana Clossy on 21 May 2020 on behalf of the Honourable Roger Cook, the Minister for Health and Deputy Premier, when you contrast what the Chamber was told in May with the response of the Leader of the House just now, which is next Tuesday she's going to table that advice. So what's changed between 21 May and today's date that no longer Cabinet in confidence applies to these documents? Maybe it is that the government's decided that it's in the public interest to table these Cabinet documents. It will be interesting to read on Tuesday, Madam President, what's contained in the documents that the Leader of the House has committed to tabling, and whether or not the statement made by the Honourable Alana Clossy on the 21st of May 2020 rings true. I will be paying some close attention to that on Tuesday and reconciling that with the answer given by the Parliamentary Secretary to this place on the 21st of May, where information was withheld from this Parliament. And indeed, I'm not aware if there's been a Section 82 notice provided to the Auditor-General with respect to the non-compliance of information requested by the Parliament. Now, Madam President, I want to turn to something that we in the National Party believe the government needs to start turning its mind to in the time that I've got left, and that is an event like we've experienced in the last few months through this state of emergency that has been declared arising from the pandemic ought to have, as a result, a special inquiry commissioned by the State of Western Australia. And I draw members' attention to Section 24 H of the Public Sector Management Act 1994, which enables the Public Sector Commissioner to arrange for the holding of a special inquiry into a matter related to the public sector. Under the PSM Act, a special inquiry has powers similar to those of a Royal Commission. The Commissioner may exercise these powers either on their own initiative or may be directed by the Minister. Now, that's a direct quote, Madam President, from the website of the Public Sector Commission, which I've extracted for the purposes of this debate. And it may be of members' interest that since the establishment of the Public Sector Commission in 2008, a number of special inquiries have been conducted under these provisions, including the inquiry into government programs and projects, an inquiry commissioned by this state government following the last election, the Peel Health Campus contract management and clinical outcomes, the St Andrews Hostel Katanning, how the system and society for failed our children, appreciating the risk report of the special inquiry into the November 2011 Margaret River bushfire, a shared responsibility, the report of the Perth Hills bushfire February 2011 review, and Waroona bushfire special inquiry. So those last three special inquiries, Madam President, that I've quoted just now relate to emergency events, natural disasters that occurred in the state of Western Australia that resulted in a special inquiry. And so we think that this pandemic, this state of emergency and its response by the government and its agencies ought to be subject to a special inquiry, not to apportion or identify any blame or apportion any guilt to any person, but I think what has been repeatedly said by the government is that they face uncharted waters. They are making decisions that have not been made before. And I think it's important, particularly as we speculate on whether or not we're going to see a future event, a second wave, a third wave, another strain of a virus affect our country, that we are better prepared than we were this time. And I think there are a number of areas that a special inquiry could consider. And I think the most critical part that could be considered by a special inquiry is our preparedness to respond. Because I think, given the success of containment and control of the virus, our response in terms of our health system in particular has not been tested to the level that it has been in other countries. If we had had a different response in Western Australia from government, from its citizens, and from other factors that have influenced that containment strategy, we may well have seen ourselves in a similar position to other countries, Madam President. And we haven't seen a large number of hospitalisations, but we have seen in other ways significant impacts on our health system. For example, how our health sector was unprepared, both public and private, how our health sector was unprepared for the most basic of PPE provisions, and how that resulted in the cancellation of elective surgery. Not because we didn't have hospital space or doctors or nurses or theatres, but because we didn't have enough PPE. And how the state of Western Australia relied upon the Minderoo Foundation, a private citizen and a foundation in Western Australia, to go and procure supplies from China to make sure that we had the supplies we needed to protect our frontline workers in our healthcare system. Obviously, the benefit of hindsight is wonderful to have, and I think I observed this morning an hour of the special inquiry that's occurring in New South Wales currently with respect to the Ruby Princess, the arrival of the Ruby Princess in Sydney. That's an inquiry that's already underway in New South Wales and is examining a range of matters with respect to its terms of reference in that state. Now, it's interesting that this inquiry in New South Wales will wind up on the 14th of August 2020. Now, that could be an appropriate point in time, Madam President, to perhaps consider securing the services of the Commissioner in that jurisdiction to come to Western Australia with the experience that he has learnt in New South Wales and conduct a similar special inquiry, but probably what I would argue a more broad-ranging special inquiry in relation to the West Australian response, and make recommendations to make sure that we as a community are informed, but also better prepared as a state with respect to any similar future event that might occur. And I must draw at this point, Madam President, a comparison between the clarity that's provided in the advice from the AHPPC, which is the Australian Health Protection Principle Committee, where it publishes a statement quite regularly after it meets on a whole range of matters. And members who may be interested in this could go to the Department of Health website and the AHPPC page, and you can see numerous statements on all sorts of areas, and contrast that with the published advice from the Chief Health Officer in Western Australia. And I can't find too much beyond the 20 May media statement that was tabled in this House following the question of the Honourable Robin Scott. And so I think there could be certainly a greater level of transparency to make sure that we as a House of the Parliament, but also the community more broadly, understands the underpinnings of the decisions that government is making. I think that would go a long way to giving confidence and support to the strategy that the government is embarking upon. And I look forward on Tuesday to the information that is provided by the Leader of the House, as committed by her earlier in the debate today. And Madam President, the Leader of the National Party, the Honourable Mayor Davies, wrote to the Premier on the 28th of May 2020, asking him to consider a special inquiry in the state of Western Australia. And we received a response from the Premier on the 2nd of June 2020. And the Premier has certainly left the door open to establishing a special inquiry at an appropriate time. But obviously, I think it's important that that's done sooner rather than later, but also having regard for the response that is ongoing in the state of Western Australia, because I think the sooner we can learn from how we have responded and how we may be better prepared or better placed next time, I think will put us all in a much better position, both from a health and an economic perspective. And I seek leave, Madam President, to table those two letters.
The member seeks leave to table those letters. Is leave granted? Leave is granted.